Psychiatric and neurological studies of autism and Asperger's syndrome. Prior to the 1970s, autism and what would later be termed Asperger's syndrome were not widely recognized as distinct neurodevelopmental conditions. The term autism was first coined in 1911 by Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler to describe extreme social withdrawal as a symptom of schizophrenia rather than a standalone disorder. Early psychiatric views framed it within the broader context of infantile schizophrenia or childhood psychosis, with little emphasis on neurological underpinnings until the mid-20th century. Neurological studies were minimal, as autism was seen primarily through a psychoanalytic lens, influenced by Freudian ideas of early trauma or narcissism, though without direct biological markers. The pioneering shift began in the 1920s with Russian psychiatrist Grunya Sukareva's descriptions of children exhibiting autistic traits, but her work remained obscure outside the Soviet Union. By the 1940s, Leo Kanner in the US and Hans Asperger in Austria independently described early infantile autism and autistic psychopathy, respectively, as innate conditions distinct from schizophrenia, affecting language, social interaction, and repetitive behaviors. These were viewed as rare. Kanner estimated 1 in 10,000 children, and often congenital, with some neurological speculation. For example, Kanner noted potential brain differences. However, post-1-2 studies in the 1950s and 1960s regressed to psychogenic theories blaming refrigerator mothers, emotionally distant parents, for causing autism through inadequate bonding, a view popularized by Bruno Bettelheim and rooted in psychoanalysis rather than neurology. Institutionalization was common, with treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, or psychoanalysis attempted, but no effective neurological interventions emerged until behavioral approaches gained traction in the late 1960s. Asperger's higher-functioning cases were largely ignored until the 1980s. Handling of Asperger's or autistic traits in conscription and frontline fighting during World War I. Historical records on autism or Asperger's-like traits during WY 1914-1918 are extremely limited, as these conditions were not formally diagnosed or understood. The term autism only existed as a schizophrenia symptom since 1911. Individuals with autistic traits, for example social withdrawal, sensory sensitivities, or repetitive behaviors, were likely assessed under vague military medical categories like nervous disorders, feeble-mindedness, or psychosis, which could lead to exemptions or discharges. Conscription in major powers, for example Britain, France, Germany, US, prioritized physical fitness, but mental health exemptions were inconsistent. Many with undiagnosed neurodivergence faced breakdowns, or were institutionalized post-trauma. No specific accounts detail autistic soldiers fighting at the front, but anecdotal evidence suggests challenges. Sensory overload from trenches, noise, mud, could exacerbate traits leading to higher rates of shell shock, now PTSD. Figures like British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, 1887-1976, retrospectively speculated to have Asperger's traits, served effectively in WWY despite social awkwardness, rising to leadership roles. Overall, without diagnosis, such individuals were neither systematically conscripted nor exempted. Survival depended on masking abilities or luck, with many ending up in asylums afterward. Handling of autism or Asperger's in the Russian Revolution and under the Soviet Union during the Russian Revolution, 1917, and early Soviet era, 1920s, 1930s, autism-like conditions were not distinctly categorized but fell under oligophrenia, intellectual disability, or psychopathies. The Bolshevik emphasis on social integration and labor viewed disability through a Marxist lens. Defects were seen as products of czarist neglect or war, treatable via education and collective work. Grunya Sukareva's 1920s research at Moscow's children's psychoneurological clinics promoted inclusive schooling for eccentric children with autistic traits, aligning with Soviet ideals of rehabilitation over isolation. However, under Stalin's Great Break, late 1920s, 1930s, purges and famines disrupted child psychiatry. Disabled individuals, including those with autism, were increasingly institutionalized or funneled into labor colonies if deemed productive. In the post-World War II Soviet Union, 1940s, 1960s, autism remained subsumed under schizophrenia or personality disorders, with neurological studies limited by ideological rejection of bourgeois genetics in favor of environmental causes. Treatment focused on Pavlovian conditioning and integration into society, but stigma persisted. Many were hidden in orphanages or asylums. Sukareva's work influenced a progressive strain, but overall, the system prioritized normalization through forced socialization, with little recognition of neurodiversity. Grunya Sukareva's research on autism. Grunya Efimovna Sukareva, 1891-1982, a pioneering Soviet child psychiatrist, conducted some of the earliest systematic studies on autism-like conditions in the 1920s, nearly 2 decades before Kanner and Asperger. Working at Moscow's Medico-Pedagogical Station for Nervous Children, she examined over 600 children and published key papers in 1925 to the problem of the structure and dynamics of children's constitutional psychopathies, schizoid forms, and 1926, psychoses in children. These describe 6 boys with schizoid psychopathy, now recognized as autistic traits, including intense isolation, echolalia, literal thinking, exceptional memory for details, and motor stereotypies, while noting preserved intelligence and verbal skills, resembling modern Asperger's. Sukareva emphasized constitutional, innate origins, distinguishing these from schizophrenia, and advocated educational interventions like structured play and sensory adaptation. Her work, translated into German in 1926, influenced European psychiatry, but was overlooked in the West due to language barriers and Soviet isolation. Recent scholarship credits her as the first to clinically delineate autism spectrum traits. Though her legacy faded amid Stalinist purges, she survived but shifted to adult psychiatry. Scientific research in the pioneering era of autism or Asperger's research. The pioneering era, 1920s, 1940s, marked the shift from viewing autistic traits as schizophrenia symptoms to distinct developmental disorders, driven by child psychiatry amid interwar social reforms. Key milestones. Researcher/year key contribution context impact Grunya Sukareva, 1925-1926, described schizoid psychopathy in 6 children, social withdrawal, repetitive behaviors, strong interests, innate not environmental. First systematic pediatric cases, emphasized education over institutionalization, influenced Soviet integration models. Leo Kanner, 1943, autistic disturbances of affective contact, 11 U.S. children with profound social language impairments, insistence on sameness, congenital, rare. Established infantile autism as separate from schizophrenia, sparked global interest but reinforced isolation views. Hans Asperger, 1944, autistic psychopathy in childhood, 4 boys with verbal fluency but social clumsiness, obsessions, spectrum-like potentially gifted. Highlighted higher functioning cases, work buried until 1980s due to Nazi-era stigma, but foundational for Asperger's. Research was observational clinical, lacking neurology, for example no EEGs, and influenced by eugenics debates. It laid groundwork for spectrum concepts but was hampered by W2 disruptions. Leo Kanner's research. Leo Kanner, 1894-1981, an Austrian-American psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins, published the seminal 1943 paper, Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact in Nervous Child, analyzing 11 children, aged 2-8, referred for severe isolation. He identified core features: lack of eye contact, delayed echolalia, pronominal reversal, for example saying you go for I go, obsessive rituals, and intelligent but aloof demeanor, termed early infantile autism. Kanner argued it was inborn, something organically wrong, and distinct from intellectual disability or schizophrenia, estimating extreme rarity. Later works, 1940s, 1950s, explored etiology, resisting psychogenic theories but noting family patterns, for example, professional parents. His research pioneered child psychiatry in the U.S., founding the first clinic in 1930, but was critiqued for small samples and gender bias, mostly boys. Hans Asperger's research and treatment of his patients. Hans Asperger, 1906-1980, an Austrian pediatrician at the University of Vienna's Heilpädagogik Clinic, began studying autistic psychopaths in the 1930s, publishing his landmark 1944 thesis Die autistischen Psychopathen im Kindesalter. Examining approximately 200 children, he described a triad of social naivety, poor nonverbal communication, and circumscribed interests, with intact language and IQ, framing it as a constitutional personality variant on a spectrum, potentially linked to genius, for example historical figures like Newton. He advocated corrective educational therapy, structured environments, empathy training, and leveraging strengths for independence. However, during the Nazi era, 1938-1945, Asperger cooperated with the regime, joining Nazi organizations and referring at least 44 unfit patients, including some with autistic traits, to the Am Spiegelgrund Euthanasia Center, where approximately 789 children were killed via starvation or lethal injection under T4 extensions. He publicly endorsed race hygiene in 1938 lectures, protecting his career while sending vulnerable cases to death, contradicting his later claims of resistance. Treatment of Leo Kanner's patients. Kanner's patients at Johns Hopkins received individualized, non-punitive care in his child psychiatry clinic, emphasizing observation over institutionalization. Treatments included speech therapy for echolalia, play-based behavioral interventions to build social skills, and family counseling, despite his innate ideology views. He avoided psychoanalysis or aversion therapies, focusing on environmental adaptation, e.g., predictable routines for one child with rituals. Outcomes varied. Some, like Donald Triplett, the first case, achieved semi-independent lives. Others needed lifelong support. Kanner's humane approach contrasted with era norms, prioritizing education over cure. Sigmund Freud's work on Asperger's syndrome. Freud, 1856-1939, conducted no direct research on Asperger's syndrome, as it was unnamed until 1944, post his death, and autism was merely a nascent schizophrenia term. Freud's theories indirectly influenced early autism views via primary narcissism, a normal infantile stage of self-absorption, 1914, which some later misinterpreted as pathological in autistic children. He focused on psychosexual development and trauma, not neurodevelopmental traits, and never referenced autism-like cases. Any links are retrospective and tenuous. Handling of autism, or Asperger's in fighting and conscription. During World War II, as in WY, autism Asperger's were undiagnosed during Y2, 1939-1945, so individuals with traits faced conscription based on general fitness. In Axis powers, Nazi racial hygiene deemed many unfit for service, redirecting them to euthanasia rather than fronts. Asperger himself avoided combat via medical exemption. In Allied nations, for example US, UK, exemptions were possible for mental defects, but undiagnosed autistics often served. Some thrived in repetitive roles, for example code breaking. Others struggled with chaos, leading to discharges for nervousness. No mass data exists, but retrospective analyses suggest higher vulnerability to trauma without accommodations. Autism or Asperger's in the T4 Nazi program and other genocides. The T4 euthanasia program, 1939-1941, systematically murdered approximately 70,000 disabled Germans via gas chambers, targeting life unworthy of life, for example, schizophrenia, epilepsy, a precursor to Holocaust genocide. Children with autism-like traits were included under idiocy or psychosis, killed if deemed non-productive. Approximately 5,000 child victims via decentralized child euthanasia. Hans Asperger referred dozens to Am Spiegelgrund, Vienna, where 35 autistic spectrum children died. The program expanded to occupied territories, killing approximately 300,000 total disabled by 1945, including Roma and Slavs with disabilities. Post-T4, informal killings continued, framing autism as a racial threat. This was the Nazis' first industrialized genocide, testing methods later used on Jews. Handling of autism or Asperger's in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s before the internet. The 1950s and 1970s were marked by stigma, institutionalization, and ineffective treatments, with autism seen as a parental failing. Bettelheim's refrigerator mother theory dominated, leading to blame and psychoanalytic holding therapies, for example prolonged eye contact. Institutional asylums housed most severe cases, with aversive methods like ECT or LSD experiments common. By the late 1960s, Bernard Rimland's 1964 book challenged psychogenesis, promoting biological views and behavioral therapies, for example Lavaas's ABA precursors. The 1970s saw diagnostic refinements, for example DSM-3 in 1980, and parent advocacy, for example NSAC founded 1965, shifting to special education. Asperger's remained unrecognized in the West. Without internet, isolation was acute. Families relied on scarce books, journals, with little peer support.